Imagine a world where the line between myth and reality was so thin, you could almost reach through it. Where kings claimed descent from Zeus himself, and the greatest warriors believed the gods watched their every move from mountaintops wreathed in clouds. This was the Bronze Age Aegean, and it was real. Around 1600 BCE, something extraordinary began to happen in the rocky hills of mainland Greece. A civilization rose that would become so powerful, so legendary, that 3,000 years later, we still tell their stories. But here's what most people don't know. The Mycenaeans, those warriors who inspired Homer's epics, weren't mythical heroes. They were flesh and blood rulers who built an empire through bronze, blood, and an unshakable belief that they were chosen by the divine. The Mycenaean world emerged from earlier Greek civilizations, but these newcomers brought something different, an appetite for conquest and a mastery of bronze warfare that would reshape the Mediterranean. Their kings weren't just rulers. They were warlords who commanded from fortified palaces perched on hilltops, surrounded by walls so massive that later Greeks believed only giants could have built them. These weren't the marble temples of classical Greece. These were fortresses designed for a world where power meant controlling trade routes, hoarding bronze weapons, and keeping potential rivals in check through a combination of military might and religious authority. We know about their world not just from archaeology, but from their own records. The Mycenaeans kept meticulous accounts on clay tablets, written in a script called Linear B, the earliest form of Greek writing. These weren't poetry or prayers. They were inventories, lists of bronze weapons, chariots, livestock, grain, and people. Thousands of workers, craftsmen, shepherds, and slaves, all tracked by palace bureaucrats who served kings with names like Agamemnon, though whether that specific king existed, we may never know for certain. What we do know is that these palaces controlled vast territories, each one a small kingdom unto itself. Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, each competed and sometimes cooperated in an intricate web of alliances, marriages, and conflicts. But the Mycenaeans didn't build their power in isolation. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was a connected world, more globalized than many realize. Mycenaean pottery has been found in Egypt, Italy, and the Levant. Their traders sailed alongside Cypriots, Canaanites, and Egyptians, exchanging olive oil, wine, and fine pottery for the copper and tin needed to make bronze, the metal that gave this age its name. Bronze was everything: weapons, tools, prestige objects. Control the bronze trade, and you controlled power itself. The Mycenaean kings understood this perfectly. They built their kingdoms on bronze-tipped spears and bronze-reinforced trade networks that stretched across the known world. Yet for all their military power and economic sophistication, the Mycenaeans lived in a world saturated with the divine. Every major decision, every military campaign, every harvest, required the favor of the gods. Their religion wasn't the organized pantheon of later classical Greece. It was rawer, more immediate. They worshipped in caves and mountaintop shrines, made offerings to earth goddesses and sky gods whose names we're still deciphering. The king wasn't just a military commander or administrator. He was the intermediary between his people and the divine forces that controlled their fate. His palace wasn't merely a fortress or government center. It was a sacred space where the mortal and immortal worlds met. This fusion of divine authority and earthly power gave Mycenaean kings legitimacy that no amount of bronze weapons alone could provide. They ruled because the gods willed it, and that belief would shape everything that followed in the Age of Heroes. To understand the Mycenaean world, you must understand one fundamental truth: this was a society built for war. Not the occasional border skirmish or defensive conflict, but war as a way of life, war as the primary path to glory, wealth, and immortality. The Mycenaean aristocracy didn't just fight when necessary. They trained for combat from childhood, honing skills with sword, spear, and chariot that would define their entire existence. These weren't professional soldiers in the modern sense. They were something far more dangerous: warrior nobles who believed that dying in battle was the highest honor a man could achieve, that their deeds would be sung by poets for generations, that they were following in the footsteps of the heroes who had come before them. The archaeological evidence of their warrior culture is staggering. In the royal shaft graves at Mycenae, excavated in the 19th century, archaeologists discovered something breathtaking: kings buried with arsenals. Not just a sword or two, but dozens of weapons. Bronze daggers with gold-inlaid blades depicting lion hunts. Ceremonial armor made from boar's tusks, each helmet requiring the tusks of 40 or 50 animals. Gold death masks pressed over the faces of the dead, preserving their features for eternity. One mask, famously called the Mask of Agamemnon, stared out from 3,000 years of darkness with such presence that the archaeologist who found it reportedly telegraphed, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." Whether it was actually him or not, what mattered was this: these men were buried as they had lived, as warriors whose wealth was measured in weapons, whose identity was inseparable from their capacity for violence. The signature weapon of Mycenaean warfare was the chariot. These weren't the heavy platforms of later civilizations, but light, fast vehicles pulled by two horses, carrying a driver and a warrior. Imagine the psychological impact: the thunder of hooves, the cloud of dust, the glint of bronze as a spear-wielding warrior bore down on infantry formations. Chariots weren't just military tools, they were status symbols of the highest order. Only the wealthiest aristocrats could afford to maintain horses, commission a chariot, and train for years to master the coordination required between driver and fighter. The Linear B tablets from Pylos record hundreds of chariots, meticulously inventoried by palace scribes. Each chariot represented not just military power, but social prestige, a visible demonstration that its owner belonged to the elite warrior class that ruled Mycenaean society. But warfare wasn't constant chaos. Between campaigns came the feasting, and the feasting was almost as important as the fighting. In the great halls of Mycenaean palaces, the megaron, warrior aristocrats gathered to eat, drink, and most crucially, to hear the bards. These weren't simple entertainers. They were the keepers of cultural memory, the men who transformed recent battles into epic poetry, who connected living warriors to the legendary heroes of the past. A nobleman's reputation depended not just on his deeds, but on having those deeds remembered and recited. This is why Homer's warriors care so deeply about glory, about Cleos, the undying fame that survives death. That wasn't poetic invention, that was the actual value system of Bronze Age warrior aristocrats, who understood that immortality came not from the afterlife, but from the stories told about you after you died. The bards singing in those torchlit halls were literally creating immortality, one verse at a time. All of this warrior culture rested on one essential resource: bronze. The smith who could forge a sword was nearly as valued as the warrior who wielded it. Bronze working was a complex art, requiring precise mixtures of copper and tin, intense heat, and years of experience to master. The best bronzesmiths were attached to royal palaces, their output carefully controlled by the king. When archaeologists analyze Mycenaean weapons, they find remarkable sophistication. Swords with precisely calculated tapers for balance. Spearheads with innovative socket designs. Armor pieces that protected vital areas while allowing mobility. This wasn't crude metalwork. This was engineering in service of killing, refined over generations. The Mycenaeans understood something fundamental. In a world where battles were decided by close combat, where men fought face to face with edged weapons, superior metallurgy meant survival. It meant victory. It meant the difference between a kingdom that expanded and one that was conquered. And so the forges burned, day and night, turning raw metal into the instruments of power that sustained the age of heroes. The Mycenaeans didn't exist in a vacuum. They were players in what historians now call the first truly international system, a web of great powers that stretched from the Nile to Mesopotamia, from Anatolia to the Greek mainland. Around 1400 BCE, the Bronze Age Mediterranean had achieved something remarkable: a complex diplomatic network where kings addressed each other as brother, where marriages sealed alliances, where letters traveled hundreds of miles to settle disputes, arrange trade, and occasionally threaten war. The Mycenaean kingdoms were the western frontier of this interconnected world, and their rulers were acutely aware that their actions had consequences far beyond their hilltop fortresses. To survive, let alone thrive, they needed to navigate relationships with powers that dwarfed them in size and resources. The greatest power in this world was Egypt. The New Kingdom pharaohs, rulers like Amenhotep III and Ramesses II, commanded resources that must have seemed godlike to Mycenaean kings. Egypt's wealth in gold alone was legendary. Other rulers literally begged for it in their diplomatic correspondence. We know Mycenaean Greeks had contact with Egypt because their distinctive pottery appears in Egyptian tombs and settlements, and Egyptian scarabs and artifacts appear in Mycenaean graves. These weren't random trade goods. They were markers of prestige, physical evidence of connections to the ancient world superpower. Egyptian texts mention the Tanarju, possibly referring to Bronze Age Greeks, while tomb paintings at Thebes show foreign envoys bearing gifts that match Mycenaean material culture. The relationship was asymmetrical. Egypt didn't need Greece, but Mycenaean kingdoms desperately needed Egyptian recognition, trade access, and the legitimacy that came from being acknowledged by the pharaoh. To the east loomed an even more direct threat and potential ally, the Hittite Empire. From their capital at Hattusa in central Anatolia, the Hittite kings controlled a vast territory and commanded armies that could field thousands of chariots. Their cuneiform archives, preserved in clay, give us extraordinary insight into Bronze Age diplomacy. The Hittites corresponded with virtually every major power, and their texts mention a place called Ariawa, which many scholars now identify with Mycenaean Greece, specifically referring to the kingdom based at Mycenae or possibly all of Mycenaean-controlled Achaea. The Hittite king addresses the ruler of Ariawa as an equal, as brother, the diplomatic term reserved for great kings. This is astonishing. It means the Mycenaean kingdoms, despite their relatively small size, had achieved recognition as a major power in the international system. But this status came with danger. The Hittites and Mycenaeans clashed repeatedly over control of western Anatolia, the region later known as Ionia, where Greek and Anatolian populations mixed and trade routes intersected. The glue holding this international system together was trade, and trade meant one thing above all: metal. Bronze requires copper and tin, and these metals weren't evenly distributed across the Mediterranean. Copper came primarily from Cyprus, whose very name derives from the metal. Tin was even rarer, possibly coming from as far away as Afghanistan or Britain through complex trade networks. Mycenaean kingdoms sat at a crucial junction. They could access Adriatic and Central European trade routes to the north, Egyptian connections to the south, and Eastern Mediterranean networks through Cyprus and the Levantine coast. Whoever controlled these routes controlled wealth, and wealth translated directly to power. The palace archives at Pylos record hundreds of bronze smiths, suggesting industrial-scale production. This wasn't just for domestic use. Mycenaean bronze goods, especially elaborately decorated weapons and vessels, were luxury exports that brought prestige and diplomatic leverage. But trade networks were fragile, and the balance of power was constantly shifting. Around 1300 BCE, tensions escalated. The Hittite texts speak of conflicts in western Anatolia involving Ariawa, disputes over territory and rebellious vassals. Some scholars see in these diplomatic crises the historical kernel that would later be transformed into the Trojan War legend. Whether or not there was a specific 10-year siege of Troy, the geopolitical reality is clear. Mycenaean kingdoms had strategic interests in western Anatolia, the Hittites were determined to maintain control of the region, and local rulers played both sides, seeking independence or better terms. This was the great game of Bronze Age politics. Mycenaean kings had to calculate constantly which alliances to pursue, which trade partners to favor, when to use military force and when to negotiate. They were swimming with sharks, trying to leverage their position between the great continental empires and the wealth of the Mediterranean sea lanes. For over 2 centuries, they succeeded brilliantly, punching above their weight in a world of giants. But the very complexity of the system that enabled their rise would also contribute to their fall. Because in an interconnected world, when the system breaks down, no one escapes the consequences. Of all the stories from the Bronze Age, none has captured human imagination more powerfully than the Trojan War. For 3,000 years, Homer's epic has shaped how we think about heroes, honor, and the costs of war. But here's the question that has obsessed historians and archaeologists for generations: did it actually happen? The answer is more complex and more fascinating than a simple yes or no. There was a Troy. It existed at a crucial strategic location at the entrance to the Dardanelles, the strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. Whoever controlled Troy controlled access to trade routes reaching into the resource-rich lands beyond. And archaeological evidence proves that Troy was violently destroyed around 1180 BCE, right at the end of the Bronze Age. The ruins show fire, hasty burials, and signs of siege warfare. Something catastrophic happened there. But was it the war Homer described, complete with Achilles and Hector, Helen and Paris, gods intervening in human affairs? The reality is that Homer was composing his epics around 750 BCE, roughly 400 years after the Bronze Age collapsed. He was working from oral traditions, stories passed down through generations of bards, each adding their own embellishments, their own interpretations. The Iliad and Odyssey aren't historical documents. They're something more interesting. Cultural memories, preserved in poetry, containing kernels of authentic Bronze Age details mixed with later additions and pure invention. When archaeologists examine Homer carefully, they find fascinating traces of genuine Bronze Age material culture. Boar's tusk helmets, tower shields, specific types of bronze weapons, even the layout of Mycenaean palaces, all appear in the poems with surprising accuracy. These weren't things an 8th century Greek would have known from his own experience. They were memories, preserved in formulaic verse, transmitted across the dark age that separated Homer's world from the Bronze Age he was describing. So what really happened? The most likely scenario is this. There were multiple conflicts between Mycenaean Greeks and the cities of Western Anatolia over the course of the Late Bronze Age. Troy, because of its strategic location, was repeatedly contested. One or more of these conflicts was particularly significant, perhaps involving a coalition of Mycenaean kingdoms, perhaps lasting years rather than the epic's 10. The memory of these wars was preserved by bards, compressed and dramatized, transformed from historical events into legendary narrative. The story gained power precisely because it captured something essential about the Bronze Age warrior culture: the obsession with glory, the willingness to fight for honor and prestige, the tension between individual heroism and collective obligation, the capricious nature of fate. Whether or not there was a real Achilles, there were certainly warriors like him, men who lived for battle and understood that their choices in war would define their immortality. The Trojan horse itself, that iconic image of Greek cunning, probably never existed. It's almost certainly a later invention, a storytelling device that explained how an impregnable city could fall. But the concept it represents, the idea that wars are won not just through strength but through intelligence, deception, and strategy, that was absolutely real. Bronze Age warfare wasn't just about charging at your enemy with bronze weapons. It involved siege tactics, naval operations, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare. The Mycenaeans were sophisticated military thinkers who understood that different situations required different approaches. If they couldn't take a city by storm, they would starve it out. If they couldn't win a pitched battle, they would raid and harass until their enemies were broke. The wooden horse is myth, but the cunning it represents was standard practice. What matters most about the Trojan War, historical or not, is what it meant to the Greeks who came after. For them, Troy represented the last great adventure of the Age of Heroes, the final gathering of legendary warriors before their world collapsed. And collapsed it did. Within a generation of Troy's destruction, the entire Bronze Age system disintegrated. Every major Mycenaean palace was burned. Trade networks broke down. Writing disappeared. Population crashed. The Greeks entered what we call the Dark Age, a period of poverty and isolation that lasted 3 centuries. When civilization re-emerged, it was different, classical rather than Bronze Age. But the memory of what came before persisted in the poems, in the stories of Troy and Mycenae, of heroes who walked with gods. The Trojan War became the bridge between history and myth, the last moment when the divine and human worlds touched before being separated forever. Whether the war happened exactly as Homer described is, in some sense, beside the point. It happened in the Greek imagination, and that made it real enough to shape Western culture for 3,000 years. The ruins of Troy still stand today, layer upon layer of cities, each built on the bones of the last, silent testimony to the wars that raged there when gods still walked with kings. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age world didn't just decline. It imploded. Within the span of roughly 50 years, nearly every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed or was severely disrupted. The Hittite Empire vanished entirely, its capital burned and abandoned. Egyptian power contracted dramatically after barely surviving invasions. Mycenaean palaces across Greece were destroyed, most never to be rebuilt. Trade networks that had functioned for centuries dissolved. Cities were abandoned. Writing systems disappeared. It was, in the words of one historian, the worst disaster in ancient history, a true dark age that erased centuries of cultural achievement. The question that has haunted archaeologists ever since is simple but profound: what happened? How could such a sophisticated, interconnected system collapse so completely, so rapidly? The traditional explanation pointed to mysterious invaders called the Sea Peoples, groups mentioned in Egyptian texts as attacking from the sea in massive waves. Egyptian reliefs show these warriors with distinctive feathered headdresses and round shields, different from traditional Bronze Age equipment. Pharaoh Ramesses III claimed to have defeated them, but the cost was enormous, and Egypt never fully recovered. For decades, scholars imagined the Sea Peoples as barbarian hordes sweeping across the Mediterranean, destroying everything in their path. But modern archaeology has revealed a more complicated picture. The Sea Peoples weren't a unified invasion force. They were likely refugees, displaced populations, and opportunistic raiders, themselves victims of the broader collapse. Some may have been Mycenaean Greeks, fleeing their own collapsing kingdoms. The destruction wasn't caused by the Sea Peoples. They were a symptom of the collapse, not its cause. Climate data from tree rings, lake sediments, and archaeological evidence reveals something terrifying. Around 1200 BCE, the Mediterranean region experienced a prolonged drought, possibly lasting decades. Rainfall patterns shifted. Crops failed repeatedly. In a world where agriculture was the foundation of everything, where palace economies depended on grain surpluses to feed craftsmen, soldiers, and administrators, this was catastrophic. The palace archives from Pylos, written in the final years before destruction, record desperate measures, grain shipments, requests for emergency supplies, signs of serious economic stress. When harvests fail year after year, the entire social contract breaks down. People can't pay taxes. Kings can't pay soldiers or workers. Loyalty evaporates. Populations migrate, seeking better conditions elsewhere. The carefully balanced system of international trade and diplomacy required stability, and climate change destroyed that stability at its foundation. But climate alone doesn't explain everything. The Bronze Age system had a fatal weakness. It was too interconnected, too specialized, too dependent on complexity. The great palaces functioned as economic hubs, redistributing resources, organizing production, managing trade. When they fell, they took everything with them. Craftsmen who had worked exclusively on palace-sponsored projects lost their livelihoods. Trade networks that moved copper from Cyprus and tin from distant sources required political stability, maintained ports, and established relationships. When kingdoms collapsed, these networks shattered. Without tin, you can't make bronze. Without bronze, you can't make weapons or tools. Without weapons, you can't maintain power. It was a cascading failure, where each element's collapse made the next collapse more likely. The very sophistication that had made Bronze Age civilizations so impressive made it vulnerable to systemic shock. The collapse of the Mycenaean world was total. By 1100 BCE, every palace had been destroyed or abandoned. The population of Greece may have declined by as much as 75% through death, migration, and reduced birth rates. Linear B writing disappeared completely, not to be replaced for 4 centuries. Long-distance trade evaporated, monumental architecture ceased. People lived in small villages, practicing subsistence agriculture, using simple pottery, and working with iron instead of bronze, because the complex trade networks needed for bronze production no longer existed. This was the Greek Dark Age, and it would last 300 years. But something survived: the stories. In those village gatherings, around fires, the bards still sang. They sang of Mycenae and Troy, of Agamemnon and Achilles, of a golden age when heroes walked the earth and gods intervened in human affairs. They didn't understand that they were describing their own ancestors' world. For them, the age of heroes had become myth, impossibly distant, separated from their present by a chasm of forgetting.